So Steve was appointed Professor of Education at the University of Oxford in January 2013. Previously, he was Professor of Education at the University of Warwick, Head of Research and Data Analysis at GL Assessment, and Head of Research and Evaluation at Croydon and Wandsworth Local Education Authorities. He holds a first-class BA Honours and a PhD in Psychology. He was responsible for pioneering work on value-added analysis of school performance in England, and has worked extensively with government departments and local authorities on the analysis of pupil achievement and school effectiveness. His research interests are in the associations of ethnicity, social class, and gender with a wide range of educational outcomes at all stages of schooling. He has almost 100 scholarly publications in the field, including international peer-reviewed journal articles, book chapters, and research reports. He has been an advisor to the Department for Education and recently was special advisor to the House of Commons Education Select Committee inquiry into underachievement in education by white working class children. He sits on the editorial board of British Educational Research Journal, Oxford Review of Education, British Journal of Sociology of Education, Review of Education, and research papers in education. So, over to you, Steve.
So, very nice to be invited to give this webinar, and the first webinar I've actually delivered. So I'm interested to see how it works when I'm talking to a screen rather than an audience of people. I have to keep reminding myself to keep talking, I imagine. It'd be very easy just to think I'm talking to myself and stop. So yeah, if I do stop, hit that chat button. So I want to talk for about half an hour, and it's obviously going to be a bit didactic due to the nature of the medium, but let's see how it goes. And then we'll have a bit of a break, and Sylvana will collate the answers or the questions, and a bit of question and answer session then. So, okay, so what is it I want to talk about today? Well, luckily, everything I'm talking about is already been published. So actually, if you want the full detail on what I'm talking about, there is two reports. The one on the left here, published by the Educational Endowment Foundation in 2015, and the one on the right, published by Bell Foundation earlier this year. At the end of last year, actually. So the full detail of what I'm presenting is there. So the links are on the bottom there. You can download those. But what I want to talk about is really I'm going to give you an overview here. I'm going to think about the demographics of EAL, the size of the population, EAL population, its distribution. So something about the achievement profile across the age range of 5 to 16 in England. We have national assessments at 5, 7, 11 and 16. How does the performance of EAL young people compare to the performance of kids with first language English at each of those stages? I'm then going to do some focusing in on, particularly on the outcomes at the end of Key Stage 2. Some of this language is going to be very familiar to you if you're from the world of education in England. Some of it may not be. You have to forgive me for not maybe explaining every kind of term, but Key Stage 2 is the age range from 7 to 11 in England, so the second half of primary education. So I'll focus on that to look in detail at some of the relationships between achievement and EAL status. I want to think through what are some of the risk factors for low attainment for EAL pupils, what risk factors that are unique to EAL students, not just to all students. Then I think about that report and the policy response that came from the Department for Education and the proficiency in English measure that arose from that, and then what the implications are for broader policy and practice. So that's kind of the overall picture, and it's just gone 10 past, so I've indexed myself time-wise. So here we are, we're just looking here at the number of young people recorded in the January school census as having English as an additional language. That means being exposed to a language other than English in their formative years, 0 to 5, and continuing to be exposed to that language in their homes, communities, or environments. So now we're looking at, in the most recent survey, 2018, over 1.5 million students in England. So we're talking about a very, very large number. 1.5 million young people. What does that mean in terms of the size of the population? That's actually about 19.2%, just under 20% of the population. So 1 in 5 of the school-age population in England is recorded as EAL. And you can see how that's increased from just over 7.5% back in 1997. Over the last 20 years, it's gone up to almost 1 in 5 young people. So it's a big population. How are those young people distributed across the country? Here's a nice graphic. The darker the blue shade, the higher the proportion of young people in that area. This is the 150 local education authorities in England. So the very dark blue is where there's a majority of EAL students. 50% or more of students in those areas aged 5-16 are recorded as EAL. And the very light blue is between 12.5% and 0. So we can see there's a concentration in the big urban areas around London, up in Birmingham, the North, Manchester, and those areas as well. So there's big regional variations. 6% of young people in the southwest and the northeast, okay, are recorded as EAL, so very low, but 20% in the West Midlands and up to 55%. In fact, in inner London, 55% of young people are recorded as EAL. So there's big regional variation. There's also wide local authority variation. So 17 of the 20 local authorities with the highest proportion of EAL young people are located in London. But also in that top 20 are Slough, Luton and Leicester. And also very high are places like Birmingham, Manchester. So even if you go outside of London, you're still finding quite large concentrations. But actually it's even more localised than that. There are some schools with high levels of EAL pupils in areas where there are not very many local authority pupils. If we look at the distribution school size, so here is the percentage of young people with EAL in a school, ranging from 0% to less than 1%, 1% or less, and that's 22% of schools. So a lot of schools have very, very few, if any, EAL pupils, ranging through right the way up to those schools with 50% or more EAL pupils. And there are some 1,681 schools, 8.4% of all schools, where there are 50% or more pupils recorded as EAL. And what's interesting about those schools is they're very widely dispersed. They're not just in the regions with high proportions of EAL pupils, or indeed even in local authorities. There are sometimes in schools in areas outside of London, in areas including the northwest, and areas with low proportions of EAL pupils generally. So the point about this, I suppose, is that the intake to particular schools is very skewed. There may be schools with very high levels of need in terms of a number of EAL pupils in areas actually that maybe aren't very high. So it's extremely localised, and that has implications for support and for funding. So if it can be very, very localised to school level, we have to be aware that actually geographical, even local authority distribution isn't going to be targeting the levels of need most accurately. It's very much important to think about this at the school level. That's a general point about how the population has grown and how it's distributed across the country. This slide really encapsulates some key information about the performance contrast between EAL young people and those with first language English across the different age ranges and a whole range of different measures. So I'm going to talk through this one in some detail because it is indeed quite dense in terms of the data that's there, but hopefully once we work our way through it, it's going to be quite useful to you. So we have on the left here assessments completed at 4 points within the English education system. So the early years foundation stage profile, that's completed at the end of reception year when young people are around about the age of 5. And then we have the Key Stage 1 assessments, those completed at 7. The Key Stage 2 at the end of primary school at age 11, and the Key Stage 4 at the end of secondary school at age 16. So what we have is different stages of education system. Within that, I've tried to pick out those measures of reading and maths separately, as well as the overall measure of educational success and the thresholds that usually are implicated there So what proportion of young people have achieved success in each of those domains. And then I've got here, for each of those measures at each age, what proportion of children with first language English were successful, and what proportion of young people with EAL were successful. Now, what's interesting here is how can we make any sort of comparison across different age ranges. We have different measures. We have measures where sometimes the level of success is in the 40% range and sometimes in the 63%. How can we compare our early years foundation profile outcomes with our Key Stage 2 maths outcomes, for example? That's where this third column, the odds ratio, comes in. So what we're seeing with the odds ratio is that the odds of success at 5 are much lower for EAL young people. So for an odds ratio of 0.67 means for every 3 first language English children that show a good level of development, the odds are only that 2 EAL young people will show that same level of success. So there is quite an achievement decrement for EAL young people at age 5. If we look at age 7, that is slightly ameliorated. Those are slightly lower, but there's still a decrement in terms of average proportion of young people achieving 2A or above in reading and maths. So there's still a level of lower success for EAL pupils. When we come up to age 11, we're finding that actually that changes quite substantially. So in maths, there's no longer a significant decrement. Well, with these odds ratios, we're typically saying that if the odds ratio is between 0.8 and 1.2, that's kind of in the range that we would expect. So we're kind of picking up really if that ratio is less than 0.8 or more than 1.2. So there's no maths decrement by the time children are 11. And in fact, in terms of grammar, punctuation, spelling, and marginally EAL young people are doing better. Where there is still a decrement is in reading. So at age 11, we seem to only have a performance difference between EAL pupils and first language English pupils in reading. It's gone in maths. If we look through to Key Stage 4, in terms of the overall achievements, there's again no substantial difference anymore. In terms of 5 more A stars to C grades, including English and maths, which was the metric that was the key headline measure in 2013. We find the fact that there are some areas where young people with EAL are doing better, so they're doing marginally better in maths than young people with first language English. In fact, in areas of English, of language, they're twice as likely to have a GCSE pass in any language as those with first language English. And even if we restrict that just to those languages that are taught, French, German and Spanish, because some of these any languages may be community language, I'm going to be taking a GCSE in Bengali because I'm a Bengali native speaker. But if we do it just at the taught languages, they're still 1.5 times more likely, the odds are 1.5 times higher of an EAL pupil achieving an A star to C in one of those taught modern foreign languages compared to first language English. So some levels of success are very much higher, and in terms of achieving the English baccalaureate, there is a greater degree of success for EAL young pupils, largely driven by the success in the language component of the EBAC. So it's an interesting picture, broadly speaking, of quite a big achievement decrement at 5, persisting through to 7, fading away for maths by 11, although still some identifiable issues in terms of reading, but by 16, largely no difference in the achievement of EAL and non-EAL pupils, and in fact some marked advantages for EAL pupils in areas, particularly those related to languages. Okay, that's from the first report, but I have updated that with the 2017 data. Okay, now here we've got a different, I've done this because we have a different set of measures. Here we have new sets of reading. Sorry, that's a slightly different slide than I was expecting. There we should be just slotting the 2017 on over that. Okay, there seems to be some corruption of the slides here, but essentially what we're looking at now is the 2017 measures, which should be based on the new Key Stage 2 tests. So in 2017 we have new Key Stage 2 tests, and we also have GCSEs that are now on the 1 to 9 scale. But when we look at these, we're finding a broadly similar picture, still a relatively large difference in terms of achievement at the end of reception year, at the end of the first formal year in school. Much smaller gaps actually at 7 now, although still a gap for reading. The maths gap has disappeared as early as 7 now. The gaps at 11 are purely about reading, and at 16 it's pretty much the same picture as before. Overall levels of success are actually, broadly speaking, equivalent. Higher languages for EAL young people. So that's the overall picture, cross-sectional picture in terms of achievement, which is one, as I say, of a move from quite big performance decrements early. When that surprised me sometimes when you think about how early those measures at age 5 are completed. But actually, as young people go through the system, we see very rapid progress. This is actually cross-sectional, but we'll look at some longitudinal data, and we do in fact see that that's exactly what happens, that young people with the EAL make more progress as they progress through school. So they actually are catching up all the way through. So by the time we get to 16, those differences have disappeared. So let's have a look at some of the more detailed work, looking at the Key Stage 2 end of Key Stage 2 performance. Look at the average English and Maths performance at the end of Key Stage 2 at age 11. The first thing is to think about how EAL relates to other variables. And the purpose of this slide is to show that EAL is actually very highly correlated with ethnicity. So if we look at what proportion of different ethnic groups are recorded as EAL, we'll see that it's really, really high for ethnic groups such as Bangladeshi young people, Pakistani young people, Asian, Indian, Chinese, white, other black African people. So those very, very high levels of EAL, very low levels obviously for 4% of black Caribbean young people, 0.4% of white British. So it's quite a correlation between EAL and ethnicity. When we consider these two together, ethnicity is by far the stronger predictor of educational achievement, although on its own it's very weak. It explains 1.8% of the outcome. But if we add in EAL, we get a little bit more power. We can get to explain up to 2.2%, which is very small, but actually shows you that EAL does add something in addition to ethnicity. And it's interesting to look at this combination because it says it identifies for us some combinations of EAL and ethnicity that are particularly high risk factors. So what we're looking at here is the national average is the 0 level, and that's the average performance across the whole cohort of 560,000 young people in England. This was in the Key Stage 2 2013. And I'm deviating from that the achievement of different ethnic groups and the first language English young people in red and the EAL people in blue. What's really interesting here is how there is a big gap in the achievement of EAL young people versus first language English people within some particular ethnic groups. So if you like, when we're looking here at white other groups, we see a particularly large difference between the achievement of EAL pupils and those with first language English. Similarly for Pakistani young people and indeed for black African young people, this gap is particularly large. So really actually the white other and the black African and the any other, these are the largest performance gaps. So this is interesting because we're starting to think now what are the factors that may be particularly high in terms of risk of low achievement amongst EAL pupils. So one of the risk factors if you're EAL is being from particularly white other and black African ethnicity. This is important because the EAL pupils in these groups are a very high proportion of the whole population of those groups. So they represent over 70% of young people with white other or black African ethnicity. So they're high. As we saw in the last graphic, the average achievement gap at 16 is 2.5 national curriculum months. But for Black African pupils, the gap between EAL, first language English, Black African pupils is double that. It's 5 months, and for white other ethnicity, it's 4 times larger. So the gap between EAL and first language English, white other pupils, is 10 months. So it's very, very large, much, much larger if you're from these two groups. Interestingly, both these groups have doubled in size between the 2003 and 2013 National School Census, the largest increase of any ethnic group. So if we quick look at that, we can see here we've gone from 2.1% to 4.3% of the population are now white other, and that's doubling, and the same for Black Africans, so that's now 3.3% of the population. It was 1.7%. So both these groups are now much, much larger in terms of their proportion of the population. And from another data source, the longitudinal study of young people in England, we're able to see that many of these young people are recent arrivals in the UK. Indeed, 40% of young people from these two ethnic groups are recent arrivals in the UK, compared to 3% of all pupils who have arrived in the UK sometime between the age of 5 and 14. So white other and Black African is high risk for EAL pupils. The gaps are much larger. There's a high level of migration, and there's a high number of pupils in these groups than there was 10 years ago. So that's definitely one risk factor, but can we pinpoint anything more within those ethnic groups that would also help us pinpoint where the higher levels of need might be? Well, we can do that by juxtapositioning this particular first language young people speak and their ethnicity. So when we record in the census whether a young person has English as an additional language, the school also records what that first language is. And we can then maybe look at this combination of language and white other or Black African ethnicity to see if we can actually even further tease apart what the kind of driving factors might be. So we looked at the top 10 languages other than English within each of these ethnic groups and compared achievement against young people from the same ethnic group whose first language was English. So if we look at white other ethnicity, what we've done here, the 0 line is the achievement of white other young people whose first language is English, and then deviated from that is the achievement of young people from the white other group whose language is not English by what their first language is. And these are the top 10 languages. And what's quite clear is if it's a Western European language, Russian, Spanish, French, Italian, those actually have very little association with achievement at 16. The big differences are for the languages Polish, Turkish, Portuguese, Albanian, Lithuanian, Romanian. So if you're white other and this is one of your first languages, that's a very high relationship with the levels of achievement. So basically what we're seeing here is a reflection of some wider patterns and larger patterns of migration that particularly kicked off in 2008 from accession 8 countries. So Poland, Albania, Lithuania, Romania. That's correlated with the increase in the doubling in the size of the white other group since 2003 to 2013 is reflecting this large migration. A lot of these young people are recent entries to the UK, and those kind of languages are correlated with young people who might be coming here through migration and may be coming in with languages that are not English. They might be coming in actually throughout the school system in terms of their age. So we can pinpoint some things a lot better through proxy measures of the specific first language. If we do the same for the Black African groups, we find there is again quite a strong patterning by the particular first language. So what we find is that some largely I'm not an expert on Africa, but some largely West African languages like Yoruba and Igbo, no performance difference between Black African youngsters whose first language is English, but actually quite big differences in terms of the average performance of those whose language is Portuguese or Lingala or Somali or whatever. So again, some interesting differences that may be associated with patterns of migration from those countries. What's interesting is you have to look at this combination of ethnicity and first language, because if I look at French here, French language associated with Black African ethnicity tends to be associated with lower achievement at Key Stage 2, but the French language associated with white European ethnicity is associated with slightly higher levels of achievement at age 11. So it is this combination of ethnicity and language. So we can maybe get an idea of some of the drivers about when EAL may be associated with lower educational achievement through looking at this patterning of language and ethnicity. So that's one set of risk factors, basically, language and ethnicity. If we look at all the range of factors, what we find is most factors that are associated with the higher risk of low attainments at 11 have broadly the same impact for EAL pupils and for first language English pupils. So having a special educational needs, being entitled to a free school meal, living in an area of high income deprivation affecting children, being younger for your year group, being a boy. These are factors associated with a greater incidence of low achievement, but they're roughly equally impactful for EAL and for first language English children. But there are 4 factors that seem to have particular associations with low achievement amongst the EAL group. So what we want to understand here is what are the factors within the EAL group that might be associated with low attainment. So the first is this combination of ethnicity and first language. If you're from one of those Black African or white other groups, and particularly from one of those groups with one of the first languages we've seen, those are high risk factors for low attainment. If you've arrived during the key stage, then actually that's associated with much lower achievement as well. And we don't have in the National Pupil Database a direct measure of when young people have entered from another country, but if we don't have a measure of prior attainments, then the likelihood is they have not been in an English school, because the level of matching within the NPD is very, very high. If a young person was in a school at age 7, they would, in England, they would have a result. If they don't have a result that's matched through to the age 11 score, it's likely that they've come in from to England from outside. Now that may be from Wales or from Scotland or from Northern Ireland, but it may also be from international migration. What's interesting is that that flag for international arrival is actually much, much higher amongst EAL young people. It's 15% of EAL young people don't have a prior attainment result versus 2% of first language English. So that's another risk factor, and it's a kind of proxy for inward migration. And it's a big difference. It's associated with a 12-month, a year's gap in terms of average levels of achievement at 11. So it's big for EAL pupils, but there's no association with achievement gap at all if you don't have a prior attainment score and your first language is English. So it's a flag for some particular risk factor for EAL pupils. If you're mobile within your entry into England, if you're also moving schools, that has a particular negative impact as well, particularly for EAL pupils. It's a 4-month decrement for first language English, but 12 months for EAL young people. So if you're arriving from abroad and actually you're then being moved between schools within England, that's got a very high association with low attainment. And then you can see how factors like arriving in Dover and then a dispersal policy that moves you to a school in North Yorkshire having a double whammy, a double impact effectively. And the last thing is region. So on average, EAL young people score lower, but it's in London it's only 4 NC months. In Yorkshire and Humber it's 8. So there are some elements of regional differences as well. So there are particular risk factors that can help us identify which young people recorded as EAL kind of may be at risk for low attainment and which young people at EAL actually are not particularly at risk. And that's an important way of understanding the overall patterning that we're seeing within the data. One last thing I wanted to do was think about school factors, because one question that often gets raised is is having a high proportion of pupils with EAL in a school a risk factor not only for their achievement but for the achievement of first language English young people in those schools. So it's a high concentration of EAL pupils a risk factor for low attainment of non-EAL pupils. So there are two graphs here that look at that. We're looking on the x-axis at what proportion of young people in the school are recorded as EAL, and I've just looked at that in terms of a low at the mean level and high. So this is basically looking at the distribution in terms of one standard deviation below the mean, and one standard deviation above the mean. Specifically, that's 0%, 15%, and 33% of EAL would constitute that low, mean, and high. And the graph on the left here is looking at the average age 11 achievement, both for those with first language English and those with EAL. What's quite clear is there doesn't seem to be any, these are not significant differences in terms of the slope of this line here. For, I'm not sure if you can see the cursor as I'm moving it on the screen, but if you can see that actually for EAL young people, it's kind of these are basically flat lines. So there's a big difference. Young people with first language English tend to be doing better than EAL young people, but actually there's no relationship between the proportion of EAL kids in the school. So if we look at those who are in schools with very, very low, less than 1% EAL students, there's no difference there than being in a school with 33% EAL students. So it doesn't make much difference to the achievement. If we look at progress between 7 and 11, I was talking here about using this longitudinally, we see that that flips in the sense that if we look at who's making most progress between, given their starting point at 7 and where they are at 11, we can see it's the other way around. EAL young people are making more progress than the first language English, so they're catching up. As we see, they've basically closed the gap in terms of maths and have much reduced the gap in terms of English by 11. But again, there doesn't seem to be any association between the proportion of EAL young people in the school and the achievement of the first language English kids. I believe this is not significant. So there doesn't seem to be any additional risk factor for first language English young people associated with being in a school with high proportion, which is an important policy related point. So let me just summarise where I've come out then. We've got a large and a growing population of EAL young people. It's very concentrated in some areas, but it's quite unevenly distributed across particular schools. So there are some small schools, or some schools with large proportions of EAL and otherwise quite low local authority areas. So we have to be cognizant of the distribution is very, very variable at school level. We've seen that EAL, as we measure it in the National Pupil Database, is associated with quite big achievement gaps early in life at school, but negligible gaps for maths by age 11, and in fact negligible gaps at all in any area by age 16. We can see actually EAL pupils basically on the longitudinal data are making more progress and are catching up by 16. We see that most factors that risk for low achievement operate similarly for EAL pupils and for first language English pupils, but there are particular risk factors largely associated with ethnic or language combinations, international migration, school mobility, and the region of the country in which you live in. And that was the major conclusion of the first reports that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation here. But one of the things that report highlighted were the substantial limitations with our measure of EAL as we record it in the National Pupil Database. The main thing being that actually it is not a measure of fluency in English, which is what it's often taken to be. It's a measure of being exposed to English in your language environment, and that may be in the home or in the community, and then being exposed to that maybe in the community, which is a very broad concept, but irrespective of the child's proficiency in English. So this might mean you have a heritage language and continue to be exposed to heritage language because that's largely spoken in the community around you, but you could in fact still be entirely fluent. So what we don't think we're getting with this measure is a real measure of fluency. What we suspect is the lack of fluency is a really key issue here. And what we're seeing with these 4 risk factors that we pointed out earlier is those are probably proxies for the lack of fluency. So if you are part of those where we've seen those ethnic groups like white upper young people, where we've seen large inward migration, like Section 8 countries, where you have a direct measure of international mobility, where you don't have a prior attainment measure, where we're looking at those kind of additional factors. I think what we're seeing is these are proxies for low levels of fluency in the language of school instruction, which in this country is English, for young people from those groups. So we got some evidence of this from previous research that I've done. This is, I'll show you this graphic here. This is one large London authority I worked for, and what we did here, we looked at the data which they collected, which a large number of London authorities did throughout the 90s and early 2000s. There was a measure called the Hillary-Hester Scales, or Centre for Language and Primary Education Scales, which was a measure of how fluent young people were in English. If they spoke English as a language, how fluent were they? What we've got here is the Key Stage 2 outcomes, looking at all those people who were EAL, who were rated therefore as either beginner, needing considerable support, needing some support with learning English, or indeed were fully fluent. So what we've got here is we've got 40% of people in this authority were English as additional language. So all these pupils are EAL, but there's massive patterning of their achievement in relation to their fluency in English. So this is a range from the median point score of 21 to a median amongst beginners, through to a median of 29 for those who are rated as fully fluent in English. And in fact, that was 42% of all EAL pupils are rated as fully fluent. So what we're seeing there is that's equivalent to about 2.5 years when national curriculum levels had a meaning in terms of months of progress. That's a massive gap in terms of the levels of achievement of these 2 pupils, meaningfully related to their fluency in English. So clearly, what we know is that if we have a measure of proficiency in English, we're getting to what's really driving the performance differences between different EAL pupils. And in fact, what was important here is that if you had a heritage language, but were also fully fluent in English, you tended to be achieving better than monolingual English speakers. So actually having 2 languages was a positive benefit in terms of achievement. So fully fluent in English and with a second language, actually you did better in that context. Now, one of the things that was very, very positive about taking this message to the Department for Education was that they responded very, very quickly. Other parts of the UK, particularly Wales and Scotland, have continued to measure, have been measured since 2009, I think, in Wales, proficiency in English for very good reasons. The DfE took that on board and, in fact, decided that they would introduce the measure of proficiency in English, which is kind of what we need, because we don't really want these proxy measures of migration and particular language, ethnic combination, these kind of factors. What we want is direct measure of what's important here, which is proficiency in English, and they introduced the proficiency in English scale, which actually was the same scale which has been used in Wales. So for young people who were EAL, schools were asked to record whether they were new to English, early stages of acquisition, developing competence with English, competent or fluent. And this is absolutely key, because how fluent you are in the language of instruction in school is clearly going to be a huge determinant of how successful you are academically in school. If you're not fluent in the language of instruction, it's going to be very difficult for you to learn effectively and to perform to your full potential. And that was introduced in the school census pilot in September 2016, introduced fully from January 2017. And that was fantastic. Broadly, this is the criteria. It's a kind of best fit judgment approach. You would say here are sort of some bit like assessments were made of national curriculum levels. You would make a best fit judgment about looking at an all-rounded picture of the young person. Did they fit into which of these kind of 4 pen portraits, really? You can get the full detail by looking at the school census guide. There's the link there. And that was a very welcome policy response in the department. We were very pleased to be taken on board and to be listened to, and to have had such a clear impact in terms of the national policy. However, subsequently, things have not continued quite so positively. So the only analysis that the department has produced today at all, since this data was first collected in January 2017, is this one graph. So this is the sum total of the use that's been made in terms of publishing information publicly from this data, and it's just a simple table of what proportion, looking at all young people aged 5 to 16, are recorded at each of those 5 steps, A to E, and how many were not yet assessed. So it's actually a paucity of information, really. So there's not been any analysis that we can see that's been made of that data. It's also been the case that that data has not been released to researchers such as myself who would be interested in doing that analysis. So actually, not only have the department not done an analysis of it, they have not released the data to allow anyone else interested in EAL achievement to do any analysis of the data either. So we're left with no access to national data. However, it is possible still to work with our colleagues in local authorities and in schools to make a case for actually collecting that data from a local level. So what I did in that second report, I highlighted this. This is the link to that report there. We went to we asked a number of local authorities in England and their schools if they would be willing to share data on the EAL achievements of young people, anonymised, fully anonymised data on the EAL achievement of the young people in their, on the achievement of pupils with EAL and first language English in their authorities. So we basically had a data sharing project where 140,000 pupils in over 1,500 schools from 6 LAAs shared their data, and we're able then to send some things that are much more useful. Although it's a sample, it's a very representative sample in terms of levels of achievements, in terms of matching to the national profiles. If you look at the detail, there's a lot of detail in the report. And what we can then do is it shows some very interesting things. For example, what we're looking at here is a relationship between proficiency in English and age cross-sectionally. So what we're saying is those young people who are fluent in English only represent about 10% of young people at reception, but rises to almost 60% by age 16. So in fact, at age 16, 85% of young people are either competent or fluent in English. Whereas at age 5, it's kind of flipped the other way around. 70% are still acquiring English. So this, if you think back to what we've seen about the patterning in the levels of achievement at 5, 7, 11 and 16, this shows you the EAL population is very different in terms of their proficiency in English at those ages. So that might explain why there's very little gap at 16, but actually quite a big gap at 5. So what we've done very well in this country historically is resource the language learning needs of young people as they come into the system. And with the Section 11 support we've had historically and the Ethnic Minority Achievement Grant, we've been able to support those needs so that actually by the time young people get through to 16, their language needs have been largely addressed. There's always some degree of inward mobility, international mobility, so there are still some young people in Key Stage 4 who are not still in the process of acquiring English, but actually that's very much lower. So actually we're able to look at these kind of patterns. And we find the same kind of things that I showed you before in that Strand and Demi research, when we look at the relationship between progress in English, proficiency in English, and this is looking at reading achievement at 11 and GCSE achievement. So what we see is a really strong patterning in relationship to your proficiency in English. So those young people who are new to English at 11, very much lower scoring those at early stages of acquisition, again lower than those developing competence. Slight decrement in reading for those who are competent, but actually those who are fluent in English are actually doing better than the national average for all pupils, including those with first language English. And a similar pattern at 16, except no difference between those who are competent and national average but fluent doing better. So it's kind of the same patterning we saw in early results. So what we know from this research also is that actually the biggest factor that can explain 25% of the variance amongst EAL young people is their proficiency in English. So this is the big factor that explains why some young people with EAL may be at risk for lower attainment, but others are not. In fact, some are going to be much more likely to be higher attaining the first languages. So your proficiency in English is way and away the most powerful factor in understanding what the variation in levels of achievement and variation in need of young people is going to be. So I have talked on for a bit longer than I thought I would do there. What I would say is, that's a wonderful sample we've managed to get. Thank you to all the local authorities and the schools and the teachers in the schools that cooperated in pooling their data and allowing us to do the analysis. And thanks to Bell Foundation and Unbound for funding the project. But we haven't been able to access the national data, and ideally we do need to access the national data to have a full evaluation. Some links here to teaching and supporting materials, which are teacher support materials, came from the national strategies, which are very powerful. I can only say that those are really good resources. You can get hold of them. I think the point I want to make here is essentially that we've been very good at funding language needs. So the reason that young people are doing very well at 16 is that historically we've achieved a great deal of support for them. You can't assume going forward without the same level of intervention and support earlier in the program, in the process of learning for those young people, that they will necessarily be able to maintain the same outcomes at 16. So actually, as we've removed things like ethnic minority achievement grant, Section 11 funding, I do have some worries that unless we provide target funding, we may not see those levels of positive achievement perpetuate going forward. Nevertheless, we do have some redistributed funding, and it's broadly well targeted by funding any EAL young person for 3 years after they come into school, because that will pick up not just young people as they come into reception, but actually anybody who's an international migrant later on in their career. So broadly, it's well funded, although there is always arguments about whether it takes 3, 5, 7 years to achieve full fluency in English. I will stop there. There's some references following up some of the points I've made early on, but I'll stop there. It's very funny talking to yourself, I have to say.
You're talking to over 60 people, so thank you very much, Steve, for a fascinating presentation with very, very important implications for policy and practice. I have been collecting a number of questions. The chat has been quite active while you were speaking, so I'll try and pose some of those. I'm just mindful of the time. The first question comes from Mark, Steve, and he asks, what about Gypsy, Roma and Traveller pupils who are also EAL? Can you tell us anything about that?
Yeah, they don't appear in the figures I've given there because they're such small groups. So kind of 0.1% of the population. I know there are issues about underreporting. Some people do not report their ethnicity if they're from those ethnic groups, so there may be an underrepresentation. But the numbers are very small, even in a national data set. So they don't figure in those graphs I've shown there and in the reports. But nevertheless, I'm sure that is an issue, and if that's a big issue for you in your school, then obviously that's something you need to think about and we need to address.
Thank you. He also wants to know how confident we can be of the accuracy of the assessments as they were not moderated.
Clearly, when I was working in local authorities and we had peripatetic teams of language specialists, we would use them for a moderation process. So we would distribute resourcing based on language needs, but we would pick a random sample of 25% of schools every year, and our peripatetic EAL teachers would go in and randomly select pupils that were said to be new to English and actually do an assessment with them. So there was some auditing, which obviously meant the data was better quality, and it was a quite important professional development process for those teachers, some of whom, you know, maybe we're dealing with EAL pupils who were not a large proportion of the school population, so they didn't necessarily have a large degree of support. So it was a good professional development such a reason for them, actually. Now, the problem we have is, of course, local authorities have been systematically stripped of the resources to do that kind of work. So I don't think that the infrastructure exists at local authority level anymore in most of the country to be able to effectively undertake that moderation process, which is unfortunate because I think it would be important to be able to do that. Certainly if we were to want to target funding in any way in relation to the need, we would have to be able to moderate those judgments, and actually that I think would be a real challenge to do. So the answer is, I suppose, there will be variation in quality, but it's basically a screening test. It's not aiming to be a perfect diagnostic tool. It's aiming to be a screening test of broad levels of need. And I think for that purpose, it's sufficient to meet that purpose.
Thank you. Moira would like to know, she says, when it says adjusted for migration on slide 14, does that mean date of arrival in the UK is taken into account?
Yeah, what we've done, we've adjusted for if you don't have a prior attainment score. So what we're doing with those particular graphs there is adjusting for the socioeconomic factors, the absence of socioeconomic factors there, the absence of a prior attainment score, and the region of the UK you're in. So it's taking away some of the gross differences that might be a reflection of socioeconomic or international migration.
Thank you. Sonia wants to know, in terms of progress made by EAL pupils in England, and we're talking about slide 8, are we assuming that children in Key Stage 4 have been in an English school throughout primary school? And if not, for how long have these pupils been in school in England?
Okay, these slides are cross-sectional data. So this isn't looking at a cohort progressing through from age 5 to 16. It's saying let's look at one point in time, 2013 or 2017, at all young people in England, okay, at each of those ages. So no, that's not controlling for it. There are longitudinal analyses within the body of the report which do look at progress between 7 and 11 and progress between 11 and 16 that control for all the other factors that I mentioned. So the detail for that is in the report. But broadly what it says is what I've pointed out, that EAL young people make more progress across each of those key stages than first language English young people.
Okay, and I'm going to just have to choose one more question. What may be the reasons for no variance between EAL and other pupils at 11 years for maths when there is a high language content to this paper?
Well, I guess what you'd have to say is that although the language content can still exist in some questions in maths, it's very much lower than it is in reading. So although there may be some language content, there's very much less. And actually where that language content is removed, or not totally removed, but where it's much lower, as in maths, we see, so here we are looking on slide 9. I don't know, can you see these slides, Silvana?
Yes, yes.
So
we're on slide 9 now, yeah.
There is no difference at 7 or 11 between EAL people. There is a difference. It's not a substantial difference. They're slightly less successful in maths at 7, but that's not very large. They're very, very slightly less successful at 11. So I guess what we're saying is that the language demands are part of the reason why there's differential performance, and obviously the language demands in a reading paper are substantially higher.
Thank you very, very much. I'm afraid I have to stop. There are quite a few more questions, so we might, if Professor Steve Strand agrees, at some point bring him back for more questions. I'm going to round up now, thanking you, Steve, again for giving us your time and sharing with us your experience.